Okay, in this video, I'm going to present my argument map of Jesse Prinz's morality is a culturally conditioned response. So just as a reminder of the overarching structure of the paper. So we've got our introduction where we're introduced to what exactly relativism is, and we get the claim that this is a widely criticized view, and that moral philosophers, theologians, and social scientists reject this view and try to identify objective values so as to forestall the relativist menace. And his main claim is that he thinks these efforts have failed and that moral relativism is a plausible doctrine with important implications for how we conduct our lives and organize societies and deal with others. Okay, so the overarching structure. We've got Section 1, Cannibals and Child Brides, Section 2, Emotions and Inculcation, Section 3, God, Evolution, and Reason, and 4, Living with Relativism. So what is the point of each section? 1 starts with what we might call descriptive cultural relativism, the social science claim, the anthropological claim, that when we look at different cultures across time and place, morals vary dramatically. What are we talking about when we say morals? We're talking about their actual moral beliefs and practices, their moral values, their moral code. When we look at different cultures, what do we see? We see that their moral beliefs, practices, codes, values, whatever, dramatically vary. Okay, so that's sort of like a social scientific claim about how things are. The question then is, so what? Prinz suggests that this variation cries out for an explanation. The general idea is something like, if people believe really different things, there should be some explanation for that. For example, we believe that the sun is at the center of our solar system and the Earth travels around the sun. At a previous time, people believed that the Earth was the center of the entire celestial goings-on, and that the sun traveled around the Earth, as did everything else. So we believe different things, and this cries out for an explanation. How did we end up with different beliefs? And we can look at our background beliefs and commitments, as well as our ability to observe the world around us. So if we only have our just looking, right, if the sun goes around the Earth, we just look, we see what appears the sun going around the Earth. If we think the Earth is actually going around the sun, what we see is the sun moving the way it does. So in some sense, what's available for observation is the same either way. So how do we end up with these differing beliefs? There's one world, and we're all engaging with it. How did we get to different beliefs? Well, his claim here is that there's either restricted observation opportunities or restricted tool sort of opportunities for the previous generation's beliefs. So now we have the ability to get outside of Earth. We can send people there, we can send tools and unmanned spacecraft there, and there's some sense in which we can view, the Earth going around the sun and everything else, right? And we have various tools that allow us to make sense of the universe, the solar system and beyond, and our place in it, that just wasn't available to them. So the idea is there is this objective physical world we live in, and when we come to different beliefs about that physical world, it's a product of our lack of the appropriate observations to get to the truth, or the tools we need in order to theorize well and experimentally verify certain commitments or beliefs, whatever, right? So the idea then is that if morality were objective, if there is a moral world and we're all encountering it, how are we ending up with different beliefs? It's not just different observations, right? Other cultures haven't been able to leave the solar system, whatever the equivalent of that, or leave the Earth and see the solar system, whatever the equivalent of that is for the moral picture. And there's not like tools we can get to get at morality. So if we all inhabit the same world, how could we explain away the fact that people come to such radically different conclusions and that there seems to have been no progress over time? There's nothing for us, it doesn't look like there's anything physical or observational for us to bump into. What else could morality be? How could we all get things so different? So the idea is that variation cries out for explanation. Rhetorical question: if morality were objective, shouldn't we see greater consensus? As in, variation seems to imply there is no objective moral view. His argument ends up being a little tweaked, a little bit more different, so it's a stronger, when we map it, we'll see. But this is the idea that the variation is significant. It's not just a fact that people believe different things, and that's all there is, right? That there is nothing else beyond this variation, beyond our moral beliefs that we happen to hold. Okay, so why think that is one question, right? So why do we have our moral beliefs in the first place? So he goes through this section on the emotions and cultural inculcation. How do we get the moral beliefs or values that we have? They are grounded in emotions, and our emotions are culturally inculcated. So what is the question, though? So most of this is much of what you judge, or all of what you judge, is in some sense grounded in your emotions, and how you feel about the world is a product of the culture that you live in. So what should we think of that? Assume, for the sake of argument, that that's true. Let's not, quibble with any of the sort of quality of support for this claim. What's the so what here? It could turn out, so before we get to section 3, it's entirely possible that the moral beliefs or code that we happen to have is merely a product of the family and culture that we are brought up in, and sometimes that can be pretty specific too. Like if you're the youngest of 10 children, the way you were raised versus your oldest sibling was raised is really different, and so you'll probably be shaped, including perhaps your values and how you see the world, in different ways, right? So there's so much of just how we were brought up shapes the way that we approach the world, the way we see the world, including the way we think about the world in moral terms, in terms of good or bad, right or wrong. But so what? A lot of our sort of worldview is shaped by how we're brought up, but that doesn't mean that's all there is to the way the world is. Our views about the physical world are shaped by the cultures that we live in, and perhaps by the families that raise us. Your views about evolution perhaps can be shaped by the family that you grow up in, the religion in which you grow up, the society in which you grow up. But that doesn't mean that's all there is to evolution. And the claim is, for morality, that is all there is. So one thing that you will do then is say, well, one is a claim about the objective physical world, the other is about morality, but the question is there an objective moral world? It is entirely consistent with our having a developed sense of morality, that it depends on emotions and culture and all that stuff, and there's also an objective moral world that if we can get beyond our culturally instilled or inculcated values and sensibilities, that we could bring ourselves into alignment with. We can try to get outside of our view and hold it up to some more objective standard. The claim, though, so that's entirely consistent. That's the claim here, is that it doesn't follow just from the fact that we get this from the way we're raised, that that's all there is. So we need that next step. And that's all there is. Why think that that's all there is? So that's why this next section is crucial, that if we want to reject moral relativism, we'll say something like, yes, you're born with a certain, or brought up to hold a certain kind of worldview, including a certain kind of moral worldview, but there is an objective moral world. There are truths about what's right or wrong, good or bad, and it's part of the task of being human to go beyond the view you grew up in, to figure out what you should really believe and why, to sort of critically evaluate it. And that is where we get, the person who rejects moral relativism thinks there is something outside of the view you were just given. what could that be? So he proposes some options, right? Where could such an objective set of standards or values come from? Where could an objective moral code come from? Such that you could say, oh, the moral code I grew up with is problematic and now I have made an improvement or progressed by adopting a better moral code, as in when I say X is good, there is a sense in which that is true, objectively true, that, say, when a culture moves from one sort of practice to another, the obvious case here is a culture once practiced slavery and now slavery is abolished, is there a sense in which we can say they have made progress? And by that I mean moral progress, as in this cultural practice, not engaging in slavery, is better than the previous one. That it's better with respect to what's true. It's truly better. It is truly good. Is there room to say something like that? So where could such an objective moral code even come from? And he proposes a couple of options. One is from God. There's a God who decrees moral codes, and another option is it comes from human nature somehow. Our moral code is a product of us, or it could come from reason. And pause. So he considers objections to each of these, finds each one wanting, and so the conclusion here then is that morality comes from the way that we are raised, and that's all there is to morality. There isn't an objective moral world and truths about the moral world that we should be seeking to find. There just is our own cultural code. And then he considers the potential counterintuitive implications of this view that moral relativism is often thought to have. So allegations that it entails that anything goes, that we have no way to criticize Hitler, that moral debates are senseless, and that relativism doesn't allow moral progress. And so one thing, again, pause. I'm not trying to evaluate the view here, just recap it. So he responds to each of these allegations, sort of saying what the relativist who accepts his view would say and why it's not either not committed to this or why this isn't necessarily completely problematic or unacceptable as an implication of the view. Okay, so that's my big picture overview of the argument. Now I want to share my map. So you might pause and engage with the map yourself. I've included the link to the map, and to open up different sections, you double click on the box and you can explore the different branches of the map. Just sort of watching me go through it might feel more confusing than doing it that way, but I'm not sure. And I have highlighted which sections where I'm getting the bits of the arguments from section 1 through 4. I've made things in green that seem to be some of the most fundamental commitments or major premises in Prinz's view, and I've made a light red the things that he's considering for the sake of objection, the stuff that he doesn't actually accept. Okay, so main claim is just that moral relativism is plausible. There is a good argument for moral relativism. What is that? So let's start with section 1, cannibals and child brides. Claim, morals vary dramatically across time and place. And such variation implies or strongly supports moral relativism. So I take that to be the co-premises we could put together for the main claim. Alright, so support for the claim that morals vary dramatically across time and place. Lots of examples, right? So we've got all of the examples. Objection. One kind of objection is to deny variation. So moral variation is greatly exaggerated, the objection might go. People really agree about values, but have different factual beliefs or life circumstances that lead them to behave differently. So the clearest example of this in this background conversation, I'm going to get to his in a moment. I think the clearest case of this that often comes up has to do with funeral practices. So if you look at the funeral practices of different people in different places over time, you'll see lots of really different practices in sort of Western culture, especially in the US, we put people in a casket and we put that in a cement box and then we bury it in the ground, and there's like a embalming and displaying and lots of fancy expenses wrapped in silks, and we've got our set of practices. In another culture, you might have a funeral pyre. In another culture, you might eat the dead. In another culture, you might sort of like mummify your family member and have them displayed in your home. I'm probably oversimplifying some practice here. I am not an anthropologist. But the idea is we'll have these really different practices. And the question is, well, how different are they? Does this mean that they have different underlying values, a different underlying moral code? And one thing we could say is, no, the underlying value is actually the same. Every one of these cultures respects their dead. But how they show that respect is a product of all kinds of things, a product of their historical circumstances, their factual beliefs about the world. And when I say factual, I don't mean their factually true beliefs. I mean their beliefs about what they think is factual, as opposed to normative, about what's good or right, but about how things really are, right? So they have different factual beliefs about the world, or they're in different circumstances. And that shapes the way their values show up in their practices. If something like that is true, that could explain away, emphasis on explain away, a lot of the variation that we see across cultures. So he gives as support for this, from this kind of view, that slave owners may have believed their slaves were intellectually inferior. So that's a different factual belief. And again, I'm not saying that that's factually true. I'm saying that's their belief about how the world is. That the people they kept as slaves are like a different kind of being. They're intellectually inferior. So say the Greeks, the Greeks definitely believed non-Greeks were inferior in every way and treated them as, sort of a different kind of being. Or we can look at the Inuits who practice infanticide, and we can look at the circumstances of scarcity that they're in. And so it's not that they don't value the lives of children, it's that in order to protect the lives of children, they have to make hard choices that we don't. So it could be the underlying values are the same, but their beliefs about the world or the circumstances they're in are the reason why their practices look so different. And Prinz objects to this. He says, even if some moral differences could be explained this way, many moral differences can't be explained in this way, and then more importantly, I'm sort of rephrasing the way he puts it here, but I think it makes sense. More importantly, these aren't good explanations. These don't really explain away the differences in their practices in terms of shared values. So he says the differences in factual beliefs and circumstances don't justify slavery and infanticide. And he spells out with some rhetorical questions why he thinks that is. Instead, what we should say is that these differences explain why cultures have such different values. Okay, so that's a potential response here to this claim. So let's take it, assume for the sake of argument that indeed morals, the moral beliefs, practices, codes, standards of different groups of people across different places and times vary dramatically. And that matters. And so what? That has implications for what? For our moral reality, how things really are. Immediately, one might object, moral variation doesn't entail relativism. So in the background conversation on this, one of the most common sort of arguments is that if your view is just, well, different cultures do different things, therefore they're all right, or there's no right or wrong answer, that would be a bad argument. Sometimes this gets called the mere differences argument, that they disagree, therefore no one's right. And that is not a valid argument. The premise doesn't support the conclusion. The mere fact of disagreement doesn't mean everyone's right or there's no right answer. And we can give lots of examples where this is true. So just because two people disagree that the earth is flat or not flat doesn't mean that there's no answer, they're both right. when people disagree, one live option is someone's wrong, right? Okay, so his support for the claim that, now focus, we're looking at moral variation, not just people disagree, therefore everyone's right, but they disagree about moral stuff. And the claim here is that moral variation doesn't entail relativism. And he gives the support, again, the red means he's sort of explaining how the person who says this would justify it. Scientific theories vary dramatically across time and place, but this doesn't entail that conflicting scientific theories are both true, or that they should be understood as true relative to scientific worldviews. Someone can be wrong in this case. And his objection is, it's a bar because, yes, this is true, but that doesn't necessarily support the conclusion, because variation in scientific theories and variation in morals aren't analogous. There are relevant differences, such that the former doesn't imply relativism, but the latter does. And the claim here is that science has well-recognized standards that can be used to test, confirm, and correct when disagreements arise, and conflict leads to convergence or progress. With morals, there are no such standards, and conflict does not lead to convergence or progress. So we don't have clear standards for resolving our disagreements, and no standard according to which we've clearly made progress, is his claim. And against that, one might object, but moral progress has been made. And his claim here is, there's no clearly best standpoint from which to judge that. It may seem from our own standpoint moral progress has been made, but from other standpoints there might be room for disagreement. So this is an epistemic issue. From what standpoint can we assess moral progress? He's skeptical that there is a best one that we can justify to people who share other perspectives. Okay, so if his reasoning is good, he's responded to the most important objection here is that just because there's variation doesn't mean everyone is right or there is no best answer. Okay, and next he gives a reason, an argument for this. And so this is where section 3 comes in. Okay, so I'm looking at sections 2 and 3, sorry. So my arrows here from sections 2 and 3 come into his justification for why the variation we see suggests that we should be moral relativists. And part 1 of that answer is because the best explanation for variation is not based on reason or observation, but on emotionally conditioned, culturally inculcated values. So why think that this variation implies relativism? Because this variation is a product of emotionally conditioned, culturally inculcated values, and, next section, there is no other plausible basis for morality. There is no objective standard we can appeal to. All we have is the morals that we get from our emotionally conditioned, culturally inculcated sort of set here. So it's these two things together that support why variation should imply moral relativism. So 2.1, 3.4, and 3.5 are some of the most essential, like, major premises of the argument. Okay, so why I think that the best explanation for the variety we see is that our morals are based on our emotionally conditioned, culturally inculcated values. I'm not going to go over this in detail because I think this is probably the most straightforward part of the argument. Just that emotional conditioning and emotional osmosis are essential to, and stronger claim, the sole basis for acquiring morals and values. And so we get examples of how parents instruct their children. We've got psychology experiments that show that moral judgments are based on emotions. And he claims that moral judgments are not based on reason. Okay, so I'll leave it to you to sort of look at this and evaluate the sort of strength of the argument here. But in order to make this second claim, that not only is emotional conditioning and emotional osmosis, which is culturally inculcated, essential to our acquiring morals and values, it is the sole basis for it. It is the only way we can acquire values. That's a strong claim, right? And so this claim that moral judgments are not based on reason, they are only ever based on our emotions. Is that supported or not is an important thing to examine in the argument. Okay, so what is the complete argument here for thinking that the fact that our morals are emotionally conditioned, culturally inculcated, is what explains the moral variation? It's that emotional conditioning, blah, 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 is essential to and is the sole basis for acquiring our moral values, and that this is the kind of thing that's a product of culture, family, group, and there isn't any other explanation for why our morals vary. So we get it from the way we've grown up, and that varies across people and groups and societies and cultures, and that is why there is so much variation, and that is all there is to morality, is this next section. There is no other basis for making moral claims about what's good or right. All we have is the moral worldview that we developed as a product of the kinds of brains we have and the families and cultures that we happen to grow up in. And had you been brought up in another one, you would have had a very different moral worldview. And there's no way to get beyond that or to reason your way to an objective moral claim. There's no other basis for morality. So what's the argument for that? 3 possible foundations for an objective morality, he says. God, human nature, reason. And he argues that God is not a very plausible foundation, in part because there are all of these epistemic problems. Epistemic means having to do with knowledge. How do you know what God has commanded? And there are different religions who believe different things about the gods. And there's also philosophical problems for making morality a product of God's commands itself. If you have heard of the Euthyphro problem, which is historically connected to Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, it's more than just an epistemic problem, a problem about how do we know what God commanded. Making God the source of morality is itself problematic, and there are very few philosophers and theologians who actually accept that morality is grounded in God's commands, that he is the source of it, right? Okay, and not human nature, he says this is a normatively empty foundation for morality. So the idea is something like, perhaps there's something about it's hard to sort of square or to explain how morality might be grounded in human nature, given the variation of moral practices and values across cultures, if we have an underlying human nature, but perhaps as we evolve or something, we are evolving to have whatever, so that our values coalesce in certain ways, whatever. But the problem is no matter what, if you want to say that here's a kind of claim that essentially puts morality in human nature, which also comes from Plato. So in Plato's Republic, he has Glaucon, one of the major sort of characters of the Republic, present this view of the nature of morality. He says that morality arises because, imagine a state of sort of like lawlessness. Your best option is to be powerful enough to do what you want, take what you want, pursue your own interest without having to worry about anyone else conflicting with your own, basically hampering your ability to pursue your self-interest. The problem is that we're not powerful enough to pursue our self-interest and take what we want and achieve whatever it is we want. We're going to be trampled over. We'll be vulnerable to injustice. We'll have people who are pursuing their self-interest, which conflicts with ours, and they will take our stuff and our things and harm us or whatever, right? And so our best option is to do injustice, take what we want, pursue our self-interest. Our worst option is to suffer injustice at the hands of others, pursuing their self-interest. So we agree to live by rules that put constraints on our ability to pursue our self-interest, but protect us from other people. And so we agree to these rules because we're vulnerable. The human condition is to be vulnerable and to recognize that we're better off when we police behavior so as to find some middle ground, right, where we can avoid suffering injustice and pursue our self-interest somewhat. So something like that might ground morality in human nature. This is how people, in fact, agree to abide by rules. Just assume a story like this. That doesn't tell us that this is what we ought to do, or that it's good to do, or whatever. It's what we in fact do and why we do it. It's describing how we have agreed to work together in a way which we term the laws, and we put claims like you ought to do X with, but really it's just describing why we do what we do, right? Similarly, there's something like it's in human nature to cooperate, to engage in tit-for-tat kind of behavior because, you know, this is the best way to survive as an individual or a species. But again, this doesn't say that that is good or that that is more. It says what we happen to do and why we happen to do it and why we are sort of better off in terms of our evolutionary prospects, our prospects for surviving and procreating or whatever, if we engage in this kind of behavior. But that's, again, it's just descriptive. And then finally, reason. And here his major objection to reason being the basis of morality is that reason is evaluatively neutral, which he said before. So his arguments there are going to need, he says moral judgments are not based on reason. Reason can't tell you what to value. It can just help you figure out how to get or bring about a certain state of affairs once you know which ones you want or what you value. That's the claim here. So one kind of way to stimulate your thinking about this might be to imagine the kinds of moral views or theories about what's right or wrong that would count as objective, right? So here's if you take an intro ethics class, you'll be introduced to normative theories, normative moral theories, so theories about right and wrong, what we ought to do and why. So here's one theory. The right thing to do is to bring about the best consequences overall, impartially conceived. So it's about what makes an action right or wrong, and the right action is the one that brings about the best consequences. We need to say which consequences we're interested in. That needs to be spelled out, but to bring out the best consequences. But then the question is for who and what. Overall, impartially conceived. So we're not saying the best consequences for myself, but overall impartially conceived. That's a theory about what right action is. What is right is what brings about the best consequences overall impartially conceived. That's a potential objective moral standard for right action. Is it right? Well, did it bring about the best consequences overall impartially conceived? An alternative is, well, I don't want to get into a whole sort of view of normative ethical theory, but just that's a candidate view of what the standard is. And so the claim then is that reason can't tell us what to value, like particular consequence. I'm not sure how exactly he would want to spell this out, but looking at his previous argument and whatever, this is an area where you could give more thought when you are critically evaluating this view. Is there a possibility of reasoning about morality in such a way that we go beyond the moral views that we happen to have given the circumstances we happen to be born into and the experiences that we happen to have as we, move through life? Finally, we get to section 4, which is where he responds to objections. For mapping purposes, just to get them all in a common branch, I grouped them together as the claim relativism has highly counterintuitive implications, and then made each of the objections support for this claim, and then introduced his responses as objections to those. So relativism entails that anything goes. And he said, so I should have made this pink. For any inculcated values, judgments based on these values would be true for those who possessed them. And his response is, yeah, that's true, this major piece of support for anything goes, but values that are completely self-destructive can't last. So this is sort of like in theory, yes, anything could go, but in fact, in practice, not everything will go. Is that a compelling response to the claim? Like, in theory, anything could go, just that it in fact won't. Next objection, relativism entails that we have no way to criticize Hitler. And one kind of objection he brings up is, there's some way we can criticize Hitler. We can say that many of his beliefs were factually wrong. Many of his beliefs were false. But even if we set aside that bit, right, beyond that he held factually false beliefs, can we criticize his moral worldview? And so this would say, like, yeah, it does entail that we can't criticize Hitler in some certain sense, but even if we can't say that his moral judgments were false, we can say that they have harmful consequences for other people, and we can refuse to accept them. We can act to prevent them. Relativism doesn't entail tolerance, like we have to tolerate Hitler. It just means that we can't say in some objective way that Hitler's moral worldview, his moral code, his values, his judgments, we can't say that they were false, that they were objectively false, bad, or wrong. The best we can do is say that we don't have to tolerate them. And interestingly, one of the big things that people often want to say about relativism is that it's the tolerant view. But relativism doesn't entail that you have to be tolerant. If you live in an intolerant culture and it's part of your moral code to not tolerate other cultures, if you're an imperialist culture, there's no sense in which, imperializing or whatever, colonializing is wrong. But that doesn't mean other people have to submit to it. Is this a compelling response? Next, relativism entails that moral debates are senseless. He argues against this. He says maybe some are, but not all. We can settle debate by focusing on common ground, and we can apply and extend the values that we actually agree on to novel cases, and we can get people real excited about the things that they already value. But yeah, some of it will be senseless, as in if we hold different moral values, it's senseless not just in fact we're going to have a really hard time convincing people, which is definitely, I think, obviously true. But it's senseless in the sense there's nothing to argue about here. No one is right or wrong. So it only makes sense to engage in debate when there's something to figure out, which is, given what I already believe, what should I believe about X? Given the values I have, how does that apply to X? Or how can I get people really excited about what I believe so they want to do what I want to do? That's the sense in which moral debates are still sensible things to engage in. And finally, relativism doesn't allow moral progress. And he objects to this. And here, he doesn't really object to the claim. It's more like, yeah, we can't make progress with the thing that you want to say. So when we say we've made moral progress, say the typical example is slavery. That in abolishing slavery, a society that doesn't have slavery is morally better, with respect to that at least, than the one that does. That slavery is morally wrong. It is bad. We can't make those claims in an objective sense, and we can't say that slavery bad, abolish slavery good, so better, progress. We can't say that. Not as a moral relativist. And so he essentially says, yeah, so we can't make progress with respect to what's truly good. according to some objective standard, right? So we can't say that the post-slavery society has made progress with respect to moral truth about what's really good and right. But we can make progress with respect to other criteria that we might happen to care about. So we can become increasingly internally consistent in our judgments. So if you have judgment A, B, and C, and you think about it and it actually implies not D, but you believe D, you got to figure out how to make your worldview fit together so you don't believe contradictory stuff. And so there might be a sense in which our judgments can improve, we can make progress by being more consistent and having worked out our worldview in more detail. Or we might be able to achieve some other value, like we can make society more stable over the long term or something. But what we can't do is improve by doing better, by having more true beliefs about what's right and good than we did before. So there's a sense in which we make progress, but it's not that sense that you might have thought. Okay, so that is my overview of Prinz's argument. So the next step is critically evaluating it and figuring out where it's most interestingly open to objection. So is there an interesting case to be made that we really don't vary as much as it seems? We actually share mostly the same underlying values, but our practices look different. Or do we agree, no, there's definitely lots of variation. The thing is that doesn't imply that there is no objective moral reality that we're trying to figure out. There's just a lot of people who disagree, and some of them are wrong. That's an option, right? Or do we accept his line of argument here? I think the most important part of his argument that this variation suggests relativism comes in this part where we explain where we get our moral worldview and pair that with, and there's no other place a moral worldview could come from. And once we get our worldview from something that just happens to vary with, it's emotional and culturally inculcated, that should lead us to question the extent to which our worldview is objective. Ours, it just happens to be a product of the way we were raised. So unless we've done a lot of extra work, we should already be questioning whether or not our worldview is worthy of some sort of objective, being held up as an objective standard. But there are parts of this argument you might look at. So especially, as I said before, the claim that this is the sole basis for acquiring morals and values, that it can't be done on the basis of reason or in some sort of strategic way to get outside of the worldview we just happen to inherit to find a more objective one that we can't critically evaluate ourselves and do better. That's an interesting place to go with. This part of the argument that there's no other basis for morality, there's lots of room to engage here. That was a very short overview. Do his responses to these implications, are they compelling or not? That's a place where you can critically engage. And then finally, something that is emphasized in some other critical papers on moral relativism that I have in mind in the background conversation here. Something that I think the person who objects to moral relativism would emphasize is at the end of Prinz's article, he emphasizes the fact that, where did it go? That we can come to understand that the values we happen to hold, our moral worldview, is mutable and parochial. And so something that the person who objects to moral relativism will often say is, yeah, that's true. That when we make snap decisions from the perspective of a moral worldview that we just happen to hold, given the kinds of brains we have, the experiences we've happened to engage in, the way we've been raised, and sort of having a knee-jerk judgment of somebody else's moral views or practices that are different from ours, that's that is something that we should be aware of, that we should be critical of, that we shouldn't be quick to engage in snap judgments about other people's worldviews that assume that our own is correct when we are potentially the ones who need to update our moral worldview. These are all things that the person who thinks there is an objective moral world, reality, set of truths that we should seek, this is the kind of thing we can say. That we should be tolerant in some important sense, like we should have humility about our own ability to get at the truth. And that even if we do critically judge another culture's practice as engaging in a practice that's morally wrong, that doesn't mean we should go in and by brute force change that practice, right? So some of this came up in Midgley's piece, that in judging, we don't need to sort of judge people as a whole. We don't need to put on robes and point fingers. We don't need to go in and imperialize and colonize and change things. And we can accept that we ourselves can be wrong and work towards trying to understand and critically evaluate our own moral worldview. But it's a further step to say, that's impossible. There is no objective moral standard. The only thing we have is the cultural norms or practices of different groups. So that's the best we can say. If we say eating meat is wrong, we're just saying according to religion X or culture Y, eating meat is wrong. That's all there is. There is no more. Okay. I feel like I sort of went a bit, that last bit might not have been clear, but hopefully it was. Feel free to follow up if you have questions. So that concludes our overview of Prinz's morality as a culturally conditioned response.